I want to make a few comments on the issue of fuel prices. There has been reporting in recent days on the price of fuel, and for good reason. I am hugely concerned at the level of price that consumers are currently paying at the pump for fuel. It is an unavoidable cost for many. The international price of crude oil has risen almost 30% just this year, but that doesn't tell us the full picture of what is going on in New Zealand. In 2008, we had one of the lowest pre-tax costs in the OECD. Today, New Zealand has the highest pre-tax cost for fuel in the OECD. Between 2008 and 2017, the margins importers were taking for themselves more than doubled, from 7% to 16%. That increase represents a transfer of wealth from petrol consumers to producers to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. To break it down just a little bit further, between the 27th of October 2017 and 28th September 2018, this is where we have data, petrol prices have risen roughly 39 cents, of which 6.8 cents at that point could be attributed to taxes and levies, 22 cents roughly to importer costs, and 9.8 cents to importer margins. I do not see that as acceptable. We also have different fuel prices between the South Island and Wellington versus the rest of the North Island. While there may be a slightly high cost of transportation in the South Island, it is no way near equivalent to the difference in fuel prices now. Prior to the 2015, fuel prices were reasonably similar across the country, but by 2017, average gross margins of the South Island and Wellington had grown to almost 10 cents versus the rest of the North Island. Now, nearly all countries in the OECD pay more than 50% of tax on the cost of fuel. That's the cost of governments investing in infrastructure that we all need to use. Fuel excise in New Zealand is one of the lower ones in the OECD, around 5th lowest. When we add excise and fuel costs together, our fuel prices are the 20th lowest out of 33 OECD countries. But I want to remind you again, pre-tax, as of today, we are the highest cost for fuel in the OECD, and some of that cannot be explained. I do not think that is acceptable. Given the concerns about anti-competitive behaviour in the fuel market, we are going to be prioritising the passing of the Commerce Amendment Bill through second and third reading in the House when we resume next week. My expectation is that it will complete all stages by the second sitting week. This bill will create the ability to undertake market studies and will compel companies to produce information to the Commerce Commission to fully understand how markets are functioning. Once the bill has been passed, there will be a 1-month transition period before the Act comes into force. We're going to make use of that transition period. Minister Whāwhoi will seek nominations from fellow ministers for possible market studies. I will be nominating the fuel market as a priority area. Minister Whāwhoi will then take a paper through Cabinet and have the terms of reference for that market study agreed, which he will then consult on. That is a statutory requirement. The study, I anticipate, will report back next year and we will prioritise a response to it. I want to acknowledge that we have been here before. The last government tried to undertake such a review but struggled to get the cooperation of the fuel industry. That is why we are passing legislation that will allow us to undertake a full market study and will require their cooperation. I have ministers with me if you have any further lines of questioning around that piece of work. Well, certainly, you cannot tell me that we do not have an issue in New Zealand when we have the highest pre-tax fuel price in the OECD, and that it's gone up by such a significant amount, 39 cents in a year, 39 cents. That's incredible. The importer margin has been part of that increase, and some of it you simply cannot find explanation for. I don't think that is acceptable. New Zealand consumers, in my book, are being fleeced.
Would you consider putting a temporary hold on the excise for part that
Yeah.
control?
Yeah, and looking, as I've said, in the last year, a 39 cent increase. Excise has been a small part of that. The issue we have is even if we remove that excise, I cannot guarantee that fuel companies would not simply absorb that themselves and that consumers would pay the same price.
Do you feel like there's been a bit of bad luck on your part, that there's been a lot of publicity around this excise, and do you feel like things are conspiring against you?
No, I think we have to look at the reality, and when you see that there has been, in such a small amount of time, a 39 cent increase for consumers, and we cannot find a good explanation for why they're paying that, it's up to us to do something about it. We've got to look at what's happening with the fuel industry. They haven't opened up their books to us in the past. We're going to have to force their hand.
What do you hope the tangible outcome of the ComCom review would be?
Well, we did, as I've said, we did have a piece of work that was undertaken in 2017. Now, that found that we, quote, cannot definitely say that fuel prices in New Zealand are reasonable. Now, that study didn't go as far as they would have liked to have, but we do know that there are options available. For instance, regulating to force existing suppliers to provide fuel terminal access to new market entrants. That might in part explain what we see happening in Wellington. Wellington has a higher fuel price on average than what we're even seeing in Auckland. That's not reasonable. We need to do something about it. The reason we need to access this, to access what's going on amongst fuel companies is to be able to answer those questions.
So are you talking about greater competition? You're definitely not talking about price controls?
Well, the option that I've just set out is about greater competition, and we know that it's obviously had an impact because you just have to look at the price differential between the South Island and Wellington and the likes of other parts of the country, including Auckland, which cannot simply be explained through transport costs.
So the fuel companies would argue that the margins are just getting back to where they were before they fell to unsustainable levels in the early 2000s, and that the profits are being used to update the infrastructure and make it safer. I mean, is there a danger here that you're going to push the fuel companies back into an unsustainable area where they're not renewing your infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, this is a significant increase that we're seeing. If you're talking about from a refining perspective, my understanding is around 19 cents per litre since the start of the year is simply around the landed cost. That's refining component, quality premium, New Zealand specifications and shipping component. But that's an incredible increase in a very short space of time, and not all of it can we find explanation for. That's why the work of the Commerce Commission would be so important in being able to answer some of those questions.
Prime Minister, has Cabinet decided whether to accept or reject ACC's call to hike their petrol tax?
Sorry, whether or not...
Has Cabinet considered the ACC call to hike their
No.
levies?
What do you say to people though, these school holidays and gearing up to summer holidays, wanting to go on a road trip, or that people are trying to get to work? This doesn't really help them right now, does it?
Yeah, not immediately, but we do need to do something about this. As I've said, a 39 cent increase, and yet we cannot demonstrate or tell New Zealanders exactly why that has happened here in New Zealand when relative to the OECD it hasn't. Yes, there's been a change in the dollar and the price of oil, but that doesn't go all the way to explaining what we are experiencing at the pump. So we've heard them, we've got to do something about it. We are going to move as quickly as we can to change the law so we can look at fuel companies.
But your government hasn't helped by putting a regional fuel tax in place in Auckland and also raising excise.
But keeping in mind, we're talking 39 cents, excise is 3.5. There's something much bigger going on here that regardless of what's happening with excise, we should be looking at.
AA wants you to take GST off fuel. Do you think that's not an option?
Again, it wouldn't answer all of the issue that we have here, and I couldn't hand on heart say fuel companies wouldn't just gobble that up anyway.
Just to clarify, will that go through urgency next week?
My expectation is that we should be able to get it through in the first 2 weeks regardless, because it's at second reading.
Do you have any other obvious options apart from
There is around transparency, ensuring that fuel wholesalers have post-terminal gate prices for petrol and diesel on display, regulating for contract terms between distributors and suppliers, and there's issues around vertical integration. So there are other options there, but again, having the Commerce Commission look closely means that we can make sure that we finally target what's going to make the biggest difference. I want to allow ministers to make any additional comment on any of those areas that one covers the Commerce Commission and one obviously the energy markets.
Just on the issue of the lack of competition in the South Island and the Wellington region, that one of the things that I've had MB in parallel doing some work on this as well, that they've talked about whether they've given me some advice about whether or not we could look at opening up terminals for greater competition. But of course we do now have the terminal being built at Timaru, which will allow new entrants to come into the South Island market, which we will be watching very closely to see if that aligns the pricing around the South Island more closely with what's happening in the upper North Island.
Any other questions on fuel? Not on fuel? All right, thanks. Oh, one more, sorry. Yeah, sorry, Bernard.
Just on fuel, which company is responsible, you think, for this increase in margins? It seems to have been closely aligned to the change to Z Energy.
I'm not going to call that out specifically. That's what we're going to utilise the Commerce Commission for.
Do you think the Commerce Commission made a mistake by allowing Z Energy to buy Govt?
I'm not going to, again, make an individual comment on that. I think we need to look at the industry as a whole.
Regarding you mentioned transparency, regulating contract terms and other options that you have, would you, if you were to implement any of that, would that be post-market study, or would you hold that as a...
Post-market study. We want to see what the Commerce Commission comes back with. We want to make sure that whatever we do, it's going to make the biggest difference possible for consumers.
Should petrol companies be legally mandated?
Sorry, should
companies be legally mandated to sell petrol at the same price in Auckland?
Again, I'm not going to preempt any of that. Of course, there will be transportation costs here, but what I'm saying is that there definitely seems to be an indication of there being a competition issue in the Wellington and South Island.
Outside of the investigation, as a moral stance, do you think it should be brought?
As a moral stance, I think New Zealanders are paying too much.